Toto is making huge moves to destabilize his rivals. Verstappen makes a massive statement to the British media after a new incident. Oscar receives advice on the 2026 car. Let's get into the latest F1 news. Sky Sports F1 has a Max Verstappen problem. And no, I am not talking about his driving. I am talking about something that has been quietly bubbling underneath the surface of British motorsport media for years, and it has finally exploded into the open in a way that nobody in that broadcast team can ignore anymore. What if the loudest voices covering Formula One are not actually giving you analysis? What if what you are watching every race weekend is something closer to a personal vendetta dressed up as professional commentary? Because here is what most fans miss. They think bias in sports broadcasting is just about favoritism, cheering for your guy a little too loudly. But the far more damaging version, the one that actually corrupts the coverage, is systematic negative bias. When a pundit dedicates their airtime not to lifting someone up, but to tearing one specific driver down, week after week, race after race, regardless of what actually happened on track. And that is exactly what has been happening on Sky Sports F1 with Johnny Herbert and his treatment of Max Verstappen. This conversation is happening right now, in 2026, because the pressure has reached a tipping point. Fans are fed up. Social media has spent years cataloging the moments. And now even people inside the industry are being asked questions they cannot dodge. So today we are going deep on this. We are going to break down where this all started, why it kept going, what it reveals about how elite sports media actually operates, and what the response from Sky and from Herbert himself tells us about whether anything will ever actually change. Stay with me, because the further we go into this, the more uncomfortable it gets. Let us start at the beginning, because you cannot understand where we are today without understanding the pattern that got us here. Johnny Herbert is a former Formula One driver. He raced through the late 80s and into the 90s, earned his reputation the hard way, and by most accounts deserves respect for his career on track. But somewhere along the line, the transition from racer to pundit created a version of Johnny Herbert that viewers started to notice had a very particular target. The moments people point to are not isolated incidents. That is the thing that most casual observers get wrong. They hear about one controversial take and assume it is a one-off, a bad day, a slip of the tongue live on television. But the Verstappen criticisms from Herbert built up into something that looked less like opinion and more like a pattern. Harsh verdicts on incidents where other drivers received far softer treatment. Strong language directed at Max in situations where the nuance clearly existed but was not being offered. An eagerness to assign blame that seemed to disappear when the driver in question was not Dutch. And here is what makes this particularly fascinating from a media psychology perspective. Viewers are not stupid. Audiences develop an incredibly sharp instinct for authenticity over time. You can watch someone give takes for a few months and not quite put your finger on it, but after years of consistent one-directional criticism toward one driver, the pattern registers. And once it registers, trust in that voice collapses completely, because everything they say becomes filtered through that lens. Even when Herbert might have a legitimate point about Verstappen, it no longer lands with credibility because the audience has already decided the conclusion was reached before the evidence was examined. That is the trap that punditry bias creates. It does not just damage the coverage of one driver. It poisons the well for the pundit themselves, and that brings us to Sky Sports as an institution, because they have a responsibility here that goes beyond one individual commentator. Sky F1 built itself into the dominant force in British Formula One broadcasting on the back of access, production quality, and the promise of expert analysis. For a long time, that promise was largely delivered, but when a pattern of bias becomes visible enough that it is generating mainstream conversation, the network has a choice: address it directly, adjust how that pundit is deployed, or do nothing and watch the credibility erosion continue. What makes the Sky situation so interesting is that they have navigated driver controversies before. The paddock is full of politics, feuds, and complicated histories. Broadcasting teams that cover Formula One know that former drivers often have personal connections and old rivalries that can cloud judgment. Managing that is part of the editorial responsibility of running a serious sports network. So the question is not whether Sky knew. The question is what they chose to do about it and when. The audience backlash around Herbert's Verstappen commentary reached levels that were impossible to dismiss quietly. Fan communities were compiling receipts, clips were circulating with millions of views. The conversation had moved from niche Formula One forums into mainstream sports discussion, and at that point, doing nothing is itself a choice. Silence becomes a statement. Inaction becomes endorsement. And yet the deeper issue here is one that goes far beyond Sky and Herbert specifically, because this situation holds up a mirror to something broken in elite sports broadcasting more broadly. The model that built punditry culture assumes that being a former participant automatically translates into objective, credible analysis. But that assumption is flawed in a really fundamental way. Former competitors carry emotional histories, unresolved rivalries, and deeply personal frameworks for evaluating success and failure. Without rigorous editorial oversight, those personal frameworks can quietly hijack the analysis entirely. The viewers who grew frustrated with Herbert's Verstappen coverage were not wrong to be frustrated. They were identifying something real. What they were watching was not dispassionate expert analysis. It was a personal narrative being broadcast as journalism. And the distinction matters enormously, because millions of people form their opinions about drivers, races, and incidents based on what they hear from these voices. When those voices are operating from hidden bias, the audience is being misled, even if nobody in the process fully realizes it is happening. Now here is where this story takes one more turn that most people have not fully sat with yet, because think about what this dynamic means for Max Verstappen himself. He is, by any objective measure, one of the greatest drivers of his generation. Multiple world championships, a career that will be studied and debated for decades, and yet a significant portion of the British viewing audience has had their perception of him shaped in part by commentary that was not designed to inform them, but that reflected the commentator's own unresolved feelings. That is not just unfair to Verstappen, it is a failure of the entire purpose of sports broadcasting. The conversation around Sky F1 and Johnny Herbert is not going to disappear. If anything, it will intensify as audiences become more sophisticated and more willing to hold broadcasters accountable publicly. The days when a network could brush off viewer complaints as fan tribalism are essentially over. Social media has given audiences an organizational capacity that did not exist even 10 years ago, and they are using it. What needs to happen is not complicated in theory, even if it is uncomfortable in practice. Editorial standards need to be applied consistently. Pundits need to be held accountable to the same fairness standards regardless of which driver is being discussed. And when patterns of bias become visible, they need to be addressed with the same seriousness that any other editorial failure would receive. Because the moment your audience stops trusting whether what they are watching is genuine, you have already lost the thing that makes sports broadcasting worth anything in the first place. And if you want to understand exactly how these dynamics play out across the whole Formula One media landscape, that video is sitting right there waiting for you. Oscar Piastri just said something that most F1 fans completely missed, and it tells you everything about why McLaren might be impossible to stop for the rest of this season. He didn't talk about pace, he didn't talk about tire management, and he definitely didn't talk about strategy calls. He talked about rabbit holes. Specifically, the rabbit holes he's been going down with his engineers to try and unlock even more performance from the MCL 40. And when a driver who's already fighting for a world championship starts describing his car prep process like a detective piecing together a mystery, you have to stop and pay attention, because something genuinely fascinating is happening inside that McLaren garage right now. Most people watching Formula One think about performance in a really surface-level way. Fastest car wins, best strategy wins, maybe the most talented driver wins, but the actual truth of how performance gets extracted from a modern F1 car is so much deeper and so much more specific than that, and Piastri is one of the few drivers on the grid right now who seems to genuinely enjoy the process of digging into that depth. Not just tolerating it, not just going through the motions with his engineers, but actually getting obsessed with it. That obsession is a massive part of why McLaren is where they are in 2026. Here's what we're going to break down today. First, we're going to talk about what Piastri actually means when he describes going down these setup rabbit holes, because it's not just a quirky phrase, it's a very real and very specific thing that happens in F1 engineering collaboration. Then we're going to look at what the MCL40 actually demands from a driver in terms of setup input, and why that relationship between Piastri and his engineering team has become one of the most effective driver-engineer partnerships on the grid. And finally, we're going to zoom out and talk about what this means for McLaren's championship prospects, because the way this team is operating right now suggests they're building something that goes way beyond just having a quick car. So let's get into it, and let's start with what a rabbit hole actually means in this context, because it's way more interesting than it sounds. When Piastri talks about going down rabbit holes in the setup process, he's describing something that every serious racing driver does, but very few do with the level of intellectual appetite that he brings to it. The process basically works like this. You go out in the car, you feel something, maybe a slight balance issue in a particular corner type, or a sensation under braking that doesn't quite feel right, or a moment where the rear feels less planted than you'd expect, given the downforce numbers. You bring that feedback to your engineer, and then you either take the simple route, which is making one obvious adjustment and moving on, or you start asking why, and then why again, and then you follow that thread until you either find the root cause or you run out of session time. The mistake most people make when thinking about F1 setup work is assuming it's mostly about the engineers making decisions and the driver just confirming whether it felt better or worse. That's not how the best driver-engineer relationships work at all. The truly elite partnerships are almost like scientific collaborations, where the driver is providing subjective data that the engineers simply cannot get from sensors alone, and the engineers are providing context and technical framing that helps the driver understand what they're actually experiencing. When those two things lock together properly, you can make setup discoveries that completely transform what a car is capable of doing. And here's the thing about Piastri specifically. The feedback about him from within McLaren has consistently pointed to someone who is extraordinarily good at describing car behavior in precise, technically useful terms. He doesn't just say it feels loose or it feels understeery. He can pinpoint when in a corner phase something is happening, under what specific load conditions, and often has a theory about what might be causing it. That level of granularity is genuinely rare, and it's exactly the kind of input that lets engineers go deeper into the setup rather than just making surface-level adjustments. The MCL40 is a car that apparently rewards this kind of deep engagement more than most. Now here's something that the casual fan probably doesn't appreciate. Not all Formula One cars are equally sensitive to detailed setup work. Some cars are relatively robust, meaning they perform well across a fairly wide range of configurations, which is actually a mixed blessing. It means less downside risk, but also potentially less upside. Other cars are more sensitive, meaning they can be genuinely transformed by finding specific setup solutions, but they can also be really difficult to live with if you haven't nailed the configuration. McLaren's car in this era has developed a reputation for being a car where the right setup unlocks extraordinary performance, and Piastri's willingness to explore unconventional setup directions with his engineers is part of how McLaren keeps finding those unlocks. There's a psychological element to this too that's easy to underestimate. Going down a setup rabbit hole requires a driver to be comfortable with the idea that things might get worse before they get better. You're exploring territory that might be a dead end. You might lose a session chasing something that doesn't work out. For a driver under championship pressure, that takes a certain kind of confidence and trust in the process. Piastri has clearly built that trust with his engineering group, and that trust is itself a competitive advantage because it means McLaren can take exploratory risks in setup that a more conservative driver-engineer relationship simply wouldn't allow. Now let's talk about what this dynamic actually means for where McLaren is headed, because this is where it gets genuinely compelling. A car that is well understood is almost always faster than a car that is theoretically faster on paper but not yet fully figured out. McLaren going into the second half of this season has the combination of a car that was already strong, a driver who is deeply invested in understanding it at a granular level, and an engineering team that clearly has the technical depth to respond to that level of input. That combination is hard to beat. What's particularly interesting is that the rabbit hole process Piastri is describing isn't something that stops once you find an answer. Every answer tends to generate new questions. Every setup discovery opens a door to another layer of optimization. Which means McLaren's performance development isn't just coming from the factory, it's coming from this ongoing loop of driver feedback and engineering response that's happening at every single race weekend. Rivals who are simply trying to outdevelop McLaren on the hardware side are potentially missing the point. The edge that Piastri and this team have built is partly cultural, partly relational, and it lives in the collaboration between a remarkably analytically minded young driver and an engineering team that is genuinely capable of meeting him at that level. That's not something you can copy overnight by just bolting on a new floor or updating your diffuser. The 2026 season is at a critical juncture right now, and the fact that Piastri is spending his time between races going deeper into setup rather than just maintaining what's already working tells you a lot about his mindset. He's not trying to protect a lead, he's trying to extend a capability. And that relentless drive to go one layer deeper, to find the next thing, to understand the car better this week than he did last week, is exactly the kind of mentality that defines drivers who don't just win championships but shape eras. If you want to understand more about how this McLaren era is being built and why their technical foundation looks so strong heading into the final stretch of the season, there's another video right here that breaks down exactly where their development advantage is coming from and why it's proving so difficult for anyone else on the grid to close that gap. The most dangerous man in Formula One right now isn't driving a car, he's sitting in a Mercedes garage, quietly dismantling Ferrari's future, one conversation at a time. Script 1. Charles Leclerc, Toto Wolff, and Fred Vasseur's story. Charles Leclerc just dropped a bombshell that nobody in Formula One saw coming, and if you think you already know this story, I promise you, you do not have the full picture yet. Because what started as a simple contract negotiation has turned into one of the messiest, most politically charged situations in the entire paddock, and the names involved: Toto Wolff, Fred Vasseur, Charles Leclerc. This is a story about loyalty, power, and a young driver who might be about to make the biggest decision of his career. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what is happening behind the scenes at Ferrari and why Mercedes might be more involved in this than anyone is letting on. Let us start from the very beginning, because context is everything here. Charles Leclerc has been at Ferrari since 2019. He came in as this extraordinarily talented young driver from Monaco, a product of the Ferrari Driver Academy, and from day one the expectation was simple: he would be the man to lead Ferrari back to championship glory. And for a while it genuinely looked like that was going to happen. Leclerc was electrifying. He was taking pole positions, he was winning races, he was doing things in that red car that made even the most hardened Formula One fans sit up and take notice. But championships, those proved to be a lot harder to come by. And here is where things start to get really interesting. Ferrari, as a team, has always had this complicated relationship with its drivers. There is a history there, a long and sometimes painful history of talented drivers who came to Maranello full of hope and left feeling like something had been taken from them. Michael Schumacher obviously bucked that trend, but think about the others. Think about the decisions made at critical moments, the strategy calls, the internal politics. Ferrari is not just a racing team. It is an institution, and institutions do not always move at the speed that elite athletes need them to. So here we are in the summer of 2026, and Charles Leclerc's future is genuinely uncertain. His contract situation has been a topic of conversation for months now, and the whispers around the paddock have grown into something much louder. People are talking, and some of what they are saying is fascinating. Because the name that keeps coming up in these conversations is not just Fred Vasseur, Ferrari's team principal, it is Toto Wolff. Now, Toto Wolff and Fred Vasseur have a history that goes way back. These two men have known each other for a long time, and their relationship is complicated in the way that only Formula One relationships can be. They have been rivals, they have been colleagues in a sense, and they clearly have a deep mutual respect, even as they compete against each other at the highest level of motorsport. But the question that everyone is asking right now is this: what exactly has been said between these two men about Charles Leclerc? Because here is the thing, Toto Wolff has been very publicly in the market for top driving talent. Mercedes went through an enormous transition when Lewis Hamilton made his shocking move to Ferrari ahead of the 2025 season. That was its own seismic event, and it left Mercedes needing to rebuild their driver lineup in a serious way. They brought in George Russell as their lead driver, and they have been looking to complement him with someone truly special. And Charles Leclerc, on paper, is one of the most attractive driver propositions in the entire sport. So the question becomes, is Toto Wolff making moves? Is he quietly, or perhaps not so quietly, pursuing Charles Leclerc while Leclerc's contract situation at Ferrari remains unresolved? And what does Fred Vasseur, who famously managed Leclerc early in his career and has a very close personal relationship with him, what does he think about all of this? Because Vasseur is not just Leclerc's team principal, he is in many ways one of the most important people in Charles Leclerc's professional life. Their bond goes beyond the typical driver-team relationship. This is where the story gets layered and genuinely complex. Fred Vasseur is not a man who panics. If you have watched him operate in Formula One, you know that he is measured, he is strategic, and he plays a long game. He does not make emotional decisions. So when Vasseur sits down to think about what Charles Leclerc means to Ferrari and what it would mean to lose him, you can bet that he is thinking about this very carefully. And Leclerc, for his part, is not naive. He understands his own value. He has been in Formula One long enough to know exactly where he stands in the hierarchy of talent, and he knows that the offers on the table are real. But let us talk about what Charles Leclerc himself has actually said, because this is where it gets really good. Leclerc has been characteristically composed in public, which is actually very telling if you know how to read him. When drivers are truly comfortable and settled, they tend to be expansive and enthusiastic when they talk about their future. They say things like, "I cannot wait to see what we do next year. I am so excited about this project." Leclerc has not exactly been saying those things. His comments have been measured, diplomatic, the kind of language that professional athletes use when they are being careful. And that carefulness speaks volumes, because Charles Leclerc genuinely loves Ferrari. I do not think anyone who has watched him over the years can doubt that. There is an emotional connection there that goes beyond just a contract. He grew up dreaming of driving for this team, the same way millions of Ferrari fans around the world grew up dreaming of watching their team win. That connection is real, and it is deep. But love for a team does not automatically mean that staying is the right decision. Ferrari has made enormous strides in recent years. The team has been genuinely competitive, and under Fred Vasseur's leadership, there has been a real sense of cultural change, of the kind of organizational improvements that have historically been Ferrari's biggest obstacle. But have they done enough? Have they convinced Charles Leclerc that this is still the project worth betting his prime years on? Because Charles Leclerc is 28 years old right now. He is in the absolute peak of his powers as a racing driver. These next 3, 4, 5 years are potentially the most important years of his entire career. If he is going to win a world championship, and make no mistake, that is what drives him, everything else is secondary, then the decisions he makes right now are absolutely critical. And this is exactly the kind of calculation that Toto Wolff understands better than almost anyone. Wolff has a gift for identifying what a driver needs, not just contractually, not just in terms of salary, but psychologically. What does this person need to believe in order to commit? What story does he need to hear? And when you are Toto Wolff, running Mercedes, one of the most successful operations in the history of Formula One, you have a very compelling story to tell. You can point to the infrastructure, the resources, the technical capability, the history of developing drivers into world champions. That is a powerful pitch. Now, Fred Vasseur is not going to just sit there and let this happen without a fight. Ferrari's team principal understands what is at stake here. Losing Charles Leclerc would be more than just a sporting blow. It would be a statement. It would send a message to the entire world that Ferrari, for all its history and all its resources, could not hold on to one of the sport's premier talents. That is a damaging narrative, and Vasseur absolutely knows it. So what cards does Ferrari have to play? They have money, obviously, enormous amounts of it. They have the emotional pull of the brand, which should not be underestimated. They have the fact that their car has been genuinely competitive and the project seems to be moving in the right direction. And they have the personal relationship between Vasseur and Leclerc, which is perhaps the most powerful card of all. When the man who helped shape your career, who has known you since you were coming up through the ranks, sits across from you and says, "I need you to trust me on this," that means something. But here is the uncomfortable truth that Ferrari has to grapple with. Trust is earned through results. And while Ferrari has been competitive, the championship has continued to prove elusive. At some point, a driver of Leclerc's caliber has to look at the situation honestly and ask himself, is this the path, or is there another path that gives me a better chance of achieving what I came into this sport to achieve? The really fascinating dimension of this whole story is the Toto Wolff and Vasseur dynamic, because when you strip away all the corporate language and all the careful public statements, what you have is two very smart, very ambitious men who both want the same thing, Charles Leclerc in their corner. And the way that plays out, the negotiations, the conversations, the behind-the-scenes maneuvering, that is the stuff that Formula One is really made of. This is not just about lap times and pit stop strategies. This is about human beings making consequential choices under enormous pressure. What we do know is that the situation is ongoing. Nothing has been officially announced. Leclerc has not signed a new Ferrari deal, and Mercedes has not confirmed any new signing. But in Formula One, the absence of news is itself a form of news. When a driver at Leclerc's level is still unsigned and the rumor mill is running this hot, it means the situation is genuinely live and genuinely contested. What I think happens next is this. The pressure will continue to build through the second half of the 2026 season. Results on track will influence the conversation enormously. If Ferrari can deliver strong performances and show that the championship is genuinely within reach, that changes the calculation significantly. But if there are more frustrations, more strategic errors, more of the kind of painful moments that have characterized Ferrari's recent history at critical junctures, then the case for staying becomes harder to make. And throughout all of this, Charles Leclerc will be watching, weighing, and deciding. He is smart enough to know that emotion cannot be the primary driver of this choice. He has worked too hard and come too far to let sentiment override strategy. But he is also human enough to feel the weight of what walking away from Ferrari would mean. For him, for the team, and for the millions of fans who have invested their own hopes and dreams in watching him succeed in that red car. This story is far from over. In fact, I think we are just getting to the most interesting part. Keep watching this channel because we are going to keep following every development, every hint, every carefully worded statement, because this is one of the biggest stories in Formula One right now, and you do not want to miss where it goes. Now let me move on to Script 2. Script 2, Valtteri Bottas, Cadillac F1, and Günther Steiner. Okay, so Valtteri Bottas might be making a comeback, and not just to any team, but to what could be the most talked about new entry in Formula One in decades. We are talking about Cadillac F1, the American team that has been trying to break into the sport for years and is now genuinely on the verge of making it happen. And Günther Steiner, the man, the myth, the legend from Drive to Survive, has something to say about it. This is the story you need to hear, so let us get into it. First, let us set the scene. Valtteri Bottas has had what you might politely call a difficult couple of years. After his time at Mercedes, where he was Lewis Hamilton's teammate and picked up a genuinely impressive number of wins and pole positions, he moved to Alfa Romeo, which later became Stake F1. The plan was clear. He would be a senior driver, helping to lead a midfield team while hopefully getting back to winning ways. It did not quite work out like that. The car was not competitive enough, the results were frustrating, and eventually Bottas found himself in the kind of position that no experienced Formula One driver wants to be in, wondering whether there was still a seat for him in the sport. But here is why the Cadillac link is so interesting and so potentially significant. Because if there is one thing that a new Formula One team needs more than anything else, it is experience. Raw talent is great, but experience is invaluable. A driver who has been on the podium at Monaco, who has won races at some of the most challenging circuits in the world, who knows what it takes to perform at the absolute highest level, that is someone who can genuinely help build a team from the ground up. And Valtteri Bottas absolutely fits that profile. Whatever criticisms have been leveled at him over the years, and there have been some, nobody can question his experience level. This is a man who spent 6 seasons at Mercedes, 6 seasons alongside arguably the greatest driver in the history of the sport. He operated in an environment where the marginal gains were everything, where the technical understanding required was extraordinary, and where the pressure was relentless. That experience does not disappear. It lives in him, and it is exactly the kind of resource that a new team trying to establish itself in Formula One would kill to have access to. Now let us talk about Cadillac for a moment, because it is important to understand what this team actually is and what it is trying to become. Cadillac, backed by General Motors, has been fighting to get into Formula One for years. There has been a long and frankly somewhat painful saga of applications, rejections, appeals, and negotiations. The commercial and political complexities of entering Formula One are genuinely enormous, and the fact that Cadillac has persisted through all of that tells you something important about the level of commitment involved. When you have General Motors behind you, one of the largest and most resourceful automotive companies on the planet, you are not playing games. This is a serious, long-term commitment to Formula One, and with the American market becoming increasingly important to the sport, thanks in no small part to the Netflix effect and the incredible growth of the United States Grand Prix, the timing for an American team entry has never been better. Formula One wants this to work. The fans want this to work, and General Motors absolutely wants this to work. But wanting something to work and actually making it work are two very different things. Formula One is littered with the stories of teams that entered with high hopes and significant resources and still struggled enormously. The learning curve is brutal, the technical complexity is staggering, and the gap between the established teams and a new entrant is genuinely massive, even in an era of budget caps. So the decisions that Cadillac makes now, about personnel, about philosophy, about who they put in their cars, those decisions matter enormously. Which brings us back to Günther Steiner, and this is where things get really fun. If you watched Drive to Survive, and let us be honest, most of us did, then you know exactly who Günther Steiner is. He is the kind of personality that Formula One does not have enough of. He is blunt, he is entertaining, he is genuinely passionate about the sport, and underneath all the quotable moments and the memorable television appearances, he is actually a very experienced Formula One team principal. He built Haas into a functioning Formula One operation from essentially nothing, and while his tenure there ended in somewhat dramatic fashion, the knowledge and expertise he accumulated over those years is completely real. So when Günther Steiner weighs in on the Bottas to Cadillac story, it is worth paying attention. Because Steiner has been there, he knows what a new team needs. He knows how hard it is to get everything right when you are starting from scratch, or close to it. And his verdict on whether Bottas is the right man for this particular job is informed by genuine, hard-won experience. The interesting thing about Steiner's perspective is that he understands the dual nature of what a driver for a new team has to be. You need someone who is fast enough to extract performance from a car that probably is not going to be at the front of the grid in year 1 or even year 2. But you also need someone who can communicate effectively with engineers, who can help develop the car in a methodical and intelligent way, and who can be the public face of a team that is trying to build its brand and attract attention. That is a very specific combination of qualities. And here is where the case for Bottas becomes genuinely compelling. He is fast. Absolutely. Even in an uncompetitive Alfa Romeo and Stake car, there were moments where Bottas showed that the underlying speed is still there. Racing drivers do not lose their talent overnight. The ability to find the limit of a car, to put together a clean qualifying lap, to manage tires intelligently over a race distance, those are deeply ingrained skills, and they do not simply vanish. What they need is the right environment to express themselves. But beyond the raw speed, think about what Bottas brings in terms of development ability. He spent years working with some of the most brilliant engineers in the world at Mercedes. He understands aerodynamic concepts. He understands what makes a car work and what makes it difficult to drive. He can sit in a car on a circuit he has never driven that particular chassis on, and within a handful of laps start giving the engineers the kind of specific, actionable feedback that takes some drivers an entire season to develop. That is an enormous asset for a team that is literally building their understanding of their own car in real time. There is also the question of marketability, and in the modern Formula One landscape, this matters more than people sometimes acknowledge. Valtteri Bottas has a genuine fan base. He has a personality that connects with people. He has been authentic in a sport where authenticity is not always easy to find. He has been open about his life, about his challenges, and fans respond to that. For a new American team trying to build its brand globally, having a driver who people already know and already like is not nothing. It is actually quite valuable. Now, the counter-argument is obvious, and it has to be addressed honestly. Bottas is not 22 years old anymore. He is not the hot new talent who is going to immediately attract the attention of the entire paddock because of his youth and his potential. If Cadillac is thinking about the very long term, if they are building toward championship contention in 5 or 7 or 10 years, then maybe the calculus changes. Maybe you want someone younger, someone who is going to grow with the team and peak at the same moment the team peaks. That is a legitimate argument, and it is one that Steiner would understand. Because Haas, during his tenure, always had to wrestle with this exact question. Do you go for the experienced guy who can deliver results in the short term, or do you go for the young talent who might take a bit longer to develop but gives you more long-term upside? There is no objectively correct answer. It depends on what the team's priorities are, what their timeline looks like, and frankly what their budget allows, because experienced drivers with strong track records tend to cost significantly more than young rookies. But here is the thing about Cadillac specifically. They are not entering Formula One to run around at the back and spend 10 years slowly improving. The General Motors backing, the ambition that has driven this project through years of obstacles, the resources they are bringing to bear, all of that suggests a team that wants to be competitive relatively quickly. They are not going to be satisfied with 15th place in the Constructors' Championship and declaring it a learning experience. That might be the realistic expectation for year 1 or 2, but the target is much higher than that. And if you want to be competitive relatively quickly, then surrounding yourself with people who already understand what competitive Formula One looks like from the inside is not a bad strategy. Valtteri Bottas has been on the front row at Monaco, he has won at Spa, he has experienced what it feels like to be in a car that is genuinely fighting for the win. That is the standard he is calibrated to, and that calibration matters when you are trying to build a team toward that level. Steiner's take on all of this is fascinating because he sits in this really interesting position. He is not affiliated with Cadillac, he is not officially advising them, but his voice carries weight in these conversations because of everything he has done. When he talks about what a new team needs and whether Bottas fits that bill, people listen. And the sense from what has been reported is that Steiner sees the logic in the Bottas option, even if he might also point to the question marks that exist around any driver who is looking to re-establish himself after a difficult period. What is also worth thinking about is what this move would mean for Bottas himself, because Formula One is not just about the teams and the politics and the business decisions. There are human beings at the center of all of this, people who have devoted their entire lives to this sport. And Valtteri Bottas is someone who clearly still has fire in him, who clearly still wants to compete at the highest level. The idea of getting a fresh start with a new team that has real backing, real resources, and real ambition, that is an enormously exciting proposition for a driver in his position. It would be a chance to redefine his legacy. Right now, if you ask a casual Formula One fan what they think of Bottas, they might say he was Hamilton's teammate. He was good, but never quite good enough to challenge for the title. He had that rough stretch at the end of his career. But if Bottas goes to Cadillac and helps build something genuinely special, if he is there when the team takes their first points, their first podium, their first win, those are the moments that rewrite narratives. Those are the moments that make people say, actually, I was wrong about him. And in Formula One, perhaps more than in any other sport, narrative matters. The stories we tell about drivers shape how we see them and how they see themselves. For Bottas, a move to Cadillac would not be a consolation prize or a graceful exit from the sport. It would be a new chapter, one with genuine stakes and genuine possibilities. The coming months are going to be critical. Cadillac is making decisions right now about their 2027 lineup, about the people they want in their corner when they take their first steps on the Formula One grid as a full constructor. Those decisions will define what kind of team they become. And if the reports linking Valtteri Bottas to this project have any truth to them, and the noise has been significant enough that it is hard to ignore entirely, then we might be about to see a story that is genuinely worth following. Formula One is at its best when it is about more than just the dominant team running away with the championship. It is at its best when there are new stories emerging, new characters stepping into the spotlight, new dreams being chased on tracks that have hosted the sport's greatest moments. Cadillac and Bottas, if this comes together, gives us exactly that kind of story. Stay subscribed because this is going to develop, and trust me, you are going to want to be here when it does.